The first time I ran a formal audit on my own father, I found $143,000 in unaccounted deposits, and a base boat registered in his name that nobody in the family had ever seen. My name is Marin. I'm 32 years old. I'm a certified public accountant with 9 years of experience, catching discrepancies that people thought they'd buried deep enough to forget. I've sat across conference tables from business owners who hid 6 figures in shell accounts and walked them through the math until their faces went gray. I've reconstructed ledgers from coffee-stained shoeboxes and made numbers confess what their owners wouldn't. But I never expected to use that skill set on the man who taught me how to balance a checkbook at the kitchen table. For 12 years, from the summer I turned 15 to the month I moved out of state at 27, my father took 30% of every paycheck I earned. He called it the family tax. He said it was my contribution to the household: mortgage, utilities, groceries. The cost of raising a daughter in a world that doesn't hand you anything. I believed him. I believed him the way you believe a man who says it with his reading glasses on and a pencil behind his ear, like he's just finished doing the math, and the math is final. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover for over a decade, was that the mortgage had been paid off since 2009, the utilities were on auto pay from my mother's disability check, and the grocery budget was half what he was collecting from me alone. Raymond thought those numbers were buried in a decade of cash deposits and handshake accounting. He hadn't counted on the fact that I grew up, got a degree, passed the CPA exam on my first attempt, and spent my entire adult career making buried numbers rise to the surface. Before I tell you what was in that binder, the one I carried into his retirement barbecue in front of 43 guests, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I always wonder how far a story like this travels. Welcome back to Karma's Keeper, where the ones who were taught to give everything are always the ones who learn to count first. If you've ever handed over money to someone who told you it was duty while spending it on something you never got invited to enjoy, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me take you back 17 years, to a 2-story colonial on Deerfield Lane, in a suburb outside Knoxville, that smelled like cut grass and engine grease, and the particular heaviness of a house where one person made all the rules and everyone else just lived inside them. My father, Raymond Elliott, was the kind of man people described with words like solid and old school. He worked at the same manufacturing plant for 28 years, floor supervisor, then shift lead, then operations manager. He wore steel-toed boots to church once by accident, and nobody said a word, because Raymond Elliott didn't make mistakes, he made decisions. The lawn was edged on Saturdays by 8 a.m. The truck was washed every Sunday after service. The thermostat was set at 68 degrees in winter, and if you were cold, you put on a sweater, because Raymond didn't pay the electric company to heat a house full of people who couldn't find a blanket. That was the kind of logic that governed everything. It was delivered without cruelty, just certainty. And certainty, when you're a child, feels a lot like safety. My mother, Carol, had been on disability since I was 11, a degenerative spine condition that put her in a recliner most days, with a heating pad behind her lower back, and the television on a volume so low, it was mostly just light. She handled what she could from that chair, sorting mail, folding laundry in a basket beside her, calling in prescriptions. The rest of the household logistics fell to Raymond by default, and he accepted them the way he accepted everything, like a man signing a work order. Efficient, without complaint, without consultation. I don't blame her for what happened. She signed what he put in front of her and trusted the man she married to manage the money the same way he managed the plant floor, thoroughly, honestly, and in everyone's best interest. I was the youngest of 3. My older brother, Tyler, left for the army at 18 and never really came back. Not in spirit, anyway. He'd call on holidays, send a card at Christmas with a generic note that read like a briefing summary, and visit once every 2 years with a duffel bag and a politeness so stiff it felt like a dress uniform. My sister, Janine, married into a family in Memphis the year she turned 21, and folded into their orbit like she'd been waiting for permission to leave ours. That left me, the youngest, the one who stayed. The one who mowed the lawn when Tyler deployed, who drove our mother to her spinal injections when Janine couldn't be reached, who learned to cook breakfast at 13 because someone had to and nobody asked. I remember the kitchen table where the family tax started. June, the summer before sophomore year. I'd just gotten my first paycheck from bussing tables at the Cracker Barrel on Route 11. $212.40 after taxes. I set it on the counter like a trophy. I remember the way the late afternoon light came through the window above the sink and made the check look almost golden. Dad picked it up, looked at it over his reading glasses, and said, $63. I asked what he meant. He set the check back down and said, your share, 30%. That's what it costs to live under this roof, eat this food, and sleep in a bed somebody else is still paying for. He said it like he was reading a weather report. No anger, no negotiation, just policy, like it had always been true and I was just now old enough to learn it. I want to be clear, I didn't argue. I didn't feel exploited. I felt promoted. Like I'd crossed some invisible line from dependent to participant, from child to contributor. He shook my hand after I gave him the cash, 3 20s and 3 1s from my first trip to the bank, and that handshake felt like the closest thing to approval I'd ever gotten from Raymond Elliott. I carried that feeling home in my chest like a coin I could spend later, and I spent it for 12 years. The motif that threads through everything, the thing I keep coming back to when I close my eyes and try to understand how I missed it for so long, is a composition notebook. Black and white marbled cover, college ruled, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at Walmart for back to school. My father kept one on the counter next to the landline phone. He wrote down what I owed each pay period in pencil, in a single column labeled M, just the initial, just a number and a date. No receipts, no breakdowns, no categories, no corresponding column showing where the money went. Just what Marin owed, and the date it was collected. I saw that notebook every morning for 12 years, walking past it to make coffee, glancing at the open page while packing my lunch. It was the ledger of my obligation, and I never once asked to see the other side of the entry. That's the part that still gets me. I was becoming an accountant. I was learning, every single day, that every debit has a corresponding credit, and I never once asked him to show me the credit. Through high school, I handed over 30% of every dollar. Summers at Cracker Barrel, then a cashier job at a hardware store my senior year, then weekend shifts at a daycare that paid $9.50 an hour under the table, and made me realize I was better with spreadsheets than with toddlers. Every paycheck, 30%. Cash, no receipts. Dad would write the number in that marbled log, and I'd watch the pencil move and feel responsible. The feeling was warm. It's embarrassing to admit that now. When I started college at UT Knoxville and worked part-time at a tax preparation office, H&R Block, the one in the strip mall near campus, the percentage stayed. When I got an internship at a regional accounting firm my junior year, $18 an hour, the most I'd ever earned, Raymond called me the night of my first direct deposit. Not to congratulate me, to confirm the schedule. Same arrangement, he said. You still come home on weekends. You still eat here. 30%. I said okay. I didn't even hesitate. The notebook was still on the counter when I came home that Friday, and there was a fresh entry in his handwriting. The date and a number that represented a third of the best paycheck I'd ever earned. The thing about becoming an accountant is that it changes the architecture of your thinking. Receipts stop being paper and start being evidence. Deposits stop being transactions and start being patterns. You begin to see every relationship as a set of books. Debits and credits, assets and liabilities, entries that balance and entries that don't. By the time I passed my CPA exam at 23, I understood double-entry bookkeeping the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Every number has a counterpart, and if the books don't balance, someone is lying or someone is lost. But I never turned that lens on my own family. That black and white cover sat between the phone and the spice rack, and I treated it the way you treat a family Bible, something you respect without opening, something you trust without reading. Now, if you've ever been the person who funded a household that never showed you the budget, the one who gave 30% and never once got a line item in return, drop a comment. Just one word. I want to know I'm not the only one who understands what it feels like to pay dues to a club that never gave you a membership card. I left Tennessee at 27, took a senior associate position at a mid-size firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, Whitfield and Associates, forensic accounting and audit services. The office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the skyline and the kind of silence that comes from rooms full of people who communicate primarily in spreadsheets. The distance was clarifying. I called home on Sundays, sent money for my mother's prescriptions when she asked, separate from the family tax, which had stopped when I moved, not because my father declared it over, but because I was no longer under the roof and the policy, apparently, was geographic. He never acknowledged the transition. 1 month I was paying, the next I wasn't. No ceremony, no thank you, no line drawn through the last entry. The marbled cover by the phone disappeared from the counter, and nobody mentioned it again, and I filed that absence the way I file every missing document. Noted, flagged, but not pursued. Not yet. The catalyst arrived in March of this year, 7 months before my father's retirement party. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, not my father, which was unusual. Her voice had the thin, careful quality of someone who's been rehearsing a sentence and still isn't sure about the delivery. She asked if I could come home for Raymond's retirement barbecue in October. 28 years at the plant. The whole family would be there. Tyler was flying in from Fort Campbell. Janine was driving up from Memphis with her kids. 40-something guests. Catered by the barbecue place on Magnolia that my father had been loyal to since before I was born. She said, "Your father would really like you to be there, Marin. He won't say it, but I'm saying it for him." I said yes. Whatever complicated machinery operated between my father and me, whatever gears had been turning since I was 15, the man had worked 28 years at the same plant and earned a party. I meant it. I wanted to mean it. I told my colleague, Denise Kwan, a forensic auditor who'd been at the firm 3 years longer than I had, and who'd become something between a mentor and a conscience, that I was going home for the weekend. She asked how I felt about it. I told her I felt fine. She looked up from her monitor and said, "Marin, you only say fine when the real answer requires a working paper." I laughed. She didn't. 2 weeks later, my mother called again. This time she was crying. Not dramatically, not the way you cry when you want someone to hear you, but the way you cry when you've been sitting with something for hours, and the pressure finally cracked the surface. She said the property tax bill had arrived, and it was $1,400 more than expected, because of a county reassessment, and she didn't know where the money was going to come from. I asked what she meant. Their mortgage was paid off. I knew that much. Had known it since I was a teenager. I asked about savings. She paused for so long I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Then she said, "Your father handles the money, Marin. He always has. I don't know what's in the accounts." I never have. Something cold and precise settled behind my sternum. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. The specific sensation I get when I'm 3 hours into an engagement and a number that should be routine suddenly isn't. The feeling of a pattern breaking. The first entry that doesn't match. I started pulling records that weekend, not because I'd decided to investigate. That language felt too adversarial for what I was doing. I pulled records because the math didn't balance, and I don't leave unbalanced books alone the same way a surgeon doesn't leave a wound open. My mother was a joint account holder on their primary checking and savings accounts, and she gave me authorization over the phone without hesitation, almost with relief, like someone handing a locked box to the first person who offered to find the key. What I found over the next 5 evenings, sitting at my dining table in Charlotte, with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it, and a cup of black coffee going cold beside the legal pad, didn't devastate me. It clarified me. The way a foggy windshield clarifies when you hit the defrost. Everything that was already there comes into focus, and you realize you've been driving blind. Between 2009 and 2021, the 12 years I paid the family tax, my deposits into the household account totaled just over $143,000. I verified every entry against my own records, my pay stubs, my W-2s, the handwritten log I'd kept in a filing cabinet since my first year at the firm, Because that's what accountants do. We keep everything. The deposits match to the penny. Every 30%. Every paycheck. 12 years of penciled entries in a kitchen counter log, confirmed by bank records that didn't know how to lie. But the withdrawals told a different story. Mortgage payments stopped in January 2009. The final payment cleared 3 years before my contributions even started. The mortgage my father said my 30% was covering had been paid off while I was still in middle school. Utility payments averaged $340 per month, covered entirely by my mother's disability direct deposit, which hit on the 3rd of every month like clockwork. Groceries ran roughly $600 monthly, also covered between her check and my father's base pay, with room to spare. The household expenses my family tax was supposedly underwriting were already fully funded before a single dollar of mine entered the account. Where did the money go? I traced it the way I'd trace any diversion, following the withdrawals downstream until they landed somewhere solid. 2 places. First, a 22-foot tracker base boat, purchased in 2014 for $38,500, registered solely to my father, docked at a marina on Norris Lake that I had never been invited to visit, and, until that Tuesday evening with my laptop open, had never known existed. Second, a hunting lease in Campbell County, $4,200 annually for 8 years, shared with 3 men from the plant, whose names I recognized from company picnics, where my father introduced them as colleagues, not co-investors in a recreational fund built on his daughter's paychecks. The remaining balance, the portion that didn't go to the boat or the lease, sat in a savings account in my father's name only, not a joint account, not a family emergency fund, a personal account my mother didn't know existed until I showed her the transfer records on a phone call that lasted 90 minutes and ended with a silence so complete I could hear the clock in her hallway through the receiver. I sat in my apartment that night staring at the photograph I'd taken years ago of that notebook, the one with the M column, all those penciled numbers in my father's careful handwriting. I'd snapped the picture once on a holiday visit, not sure why. Maybe the same instinct that makes me photograph a suspicious invoice before the client can lose it. I realized the column labeled M was never a contribution ledger. It was a collection log, and I'd been the account receivable. If you've ever opened a bank statement that confirmed what your gut had been whispering for a decade, stay with me. Subscribe, because you'll want to see how this lands. But tell me, would you have confronted him privately before the party, or would you have waited until the audience was already assembled? I spent the next 6 weeks building a binder, not an act of rage, a professional deliverable. The same kind of work product I'd present to a client review committee, or hand to an attorney for litigation support. Tabbed sections with color-coded dividers. Section 1. My deposit history. 12 years of pay stubs matched to bank entries, organized chronologically, totaling $143,217. Section 2. Household expense analysis showing mortgage retirement date, utility payment sourcing, and grocery allocation, all funded independently of my contributions, with source documents attached. Section 3. The boat purchase receipt, the marina slip fees, the hunting lease contracts, the personal savings account statements. Section 4. A single-page executive summary, I titled Family Tax Reconciliation, the kind of one-page finding I'd present to a client whose books didn't balance and who needed to understand why in 60 seconds or less. I made 3 copies, one for my father, one for my mother, one for my files. Denise reviewed it at the office on a Thursday afternoon. She read every tab. She didn't speak for 10 minutes. Then she closed the cover, set it on my desk with both hands the way you set down something heavy, and said, "The math is clean. No one can argue with this work product. What are you going to do with it?" I told her I was going to present it at the barbecue. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long time, long enough for the fluorescent lights to hum through one full cycle, and said, "Are you doing this because the numbers deserve daylight, or because you're hurt?" I thought about it. Honestly, the way she deserved. I said both, but mostly the first one. She nodded once. Then stay in audit mode. The second you get emotional, the work product becomes a weapon, and the findings become an accusation. Keep it professional. Present the facts. Let the numbers talk. They're louder than you'll ever need to be. October 14th. The retirement barbecue. My parents' backyard on Deerfield Lane, strung with white Edison bulb lights and smelling like hickory smoke from the caterer's pit, and the particular brand of drugstore cologne my father had worn since before I was born. 43 guests by my count. I counted, because that's what I do. Folding tables with red checkered cloths. A cooler full of domestic beer and canned lemonade. A banner strung between two maple trees that read 28 years strong, in gold letters on navy blue. Tyler was there in a polo shirt that still fit like a uniform, standing near the fence with a beer he wasn't really drinking. Janine had driven up from Memphis with her 2 kids, who were already running between the tables. My mother sat in her wheelchair near the dessert table, wearing a blouse I'd never seen before, smiling in a way that looked prepared. Not false exactly, but practiced. Like she'd been smiling at that angle in the mirror that morning to make sure it held. I arrived with the deliverable in a canvas tote bag in my trunk. I hugged my mother. I shook hands with uncles and cousins and plant friends whose names I half remembered. I ate a plate of brisket and coleslaw and listened to conversations about football and fuel prices and the county fair. I was calm. Not the kind of calm you perform. The kind of calm that comes from knowing the numbers are verified and the tabs are in order and the work product is sound. My father gave a speech at 6:30. He stood near the grill with a microphone someone had borrowed from the church. My father wasn't a man who shouted, but he wanted everyone to hear this. He talked about loyalty. He talked about showing up every single day. He talked about providing for his family, about making sure the people under my roof had everything they needed, even when it meant going without. He looked at me when he said the word sacrifice, held my gaze for 2 full seconds, and I felt that penciled column ghost through my memory like a phantom journal entry. A debit recorded, a credit missing, and a balance that had never been verified. After the applause, he called me over, in front of everyone. He put his hand on my shoulder. His palm was warm and heavy and calloused in a way that reminded me of being small. And he said, "Marin here." She understood responsibility before most kids understood long division. She contributed to this household from the time she was 15 years old. Every paycheck, without being asked twice. That's the kind of daughter I raised. The yard went warm with approval. People smiled. Someone near the cooler clapped. An aunt I hadn't seen in 3 years said, "That's beautiful." I let the silence hold for 4 seconds. I counted them. Then I said, "Thank you, Dad. And since you brought it up, I actually put together something to honor that contribution." I walked to my car. The tote bag was on the passenger seat where I'd left it. I carried it back through the yard, past the dessert table and the banner, and the borrowed church microphone, and I set the binder on the table next to the pan of brisket. I opened it to the summary page, the family tax reconciliation, and I spoke in the same tone I use when I present findings to a client committee. Measured, factual, without accusation in the delivery. The numbers were the accusation. I was just the presenter. Over 12 years, I contributed $143,217 to this household, under the understanding that it covered mortgage, utilities, and groceries. The mortgage was paid off 3 years before my contributions started. Utilities and groceries were fully covered by Mom's disability income and your base salary. The funds I contributed went to a base boat on Norris Lake, a hunting lease in Campbell County, and a personal savings account that Mom didn't know about. The full analysis is right here, tabbed and sourced. I've made copies. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break eye contact. I used the same cadence I use in every client presentation: clear enunciation, natural pauses, no rushed sentences. Denise would have been proud. I stayed in audit mode. I let the work product speak. My father's expression didn't change for 6 seconds. I counted those too. Then the color began to drain from his face, the way ink fades from a receipt left in the sun, slowly, starting at the edges, moving inward until the whole surface looked bleached. He looked at the tabbed pages. He looked at the yard full of 43 people who'd just applauded his speech about sacrifice. He said, "This isn't the place, Marin." I said, "You made it the place when you called me up here and used my contributions as a toast." Tyler moved first. He walked across the yard without hurrying, the way he walks everywhere. Deliberate, economical, like a man conserving energy for something that matters. He stood beside me, looked at the open file, flipped through 2 tabs with the efficiency of someone who's read briefing documents his entire adult life, and said one word. A boat? His voice was flat, military flat. The kind of flat that means the anger isn't absent. It's being stored somewhere structural, somewhere load-bearing, and it will come out later, in a form his father won't recognize. He looked at Raymond and said, "You told me Marin was helping with the house. That's what you told me when I offered to send money from my deployment pay. You said she had it handled." Janine didn't move from her seat. She had her phone in her lap, her children's laughter somewhere behind her, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance in a way I recognized. She was running calculations. Recalibrating every holiday visit, every Sunday phone call, every conversation where our father mentioned how tight things were. My mother turned her wheelchair slightly. The hydraulics hummed in the silence. She looked at the reconciliation page, then at my father, and said 5 words. "Raymond." "The savings account." That was all. But the way she said them, quietly, evenly, with the precision of someone reading an audit finding they've just understood for the first time, silenced the yard more completely than any tab or figure I'd presented. My father attempted recovery the way every client does when the findings are presented. In stages, each one less convincing than the last. The money was for the family, he said. The boat was an investment. He was planning to sell it. The hunting lease was networking for after retirement. Each explanation landed with diminishing force, like a man testing ice that was already fracturing beneath him, each step lighter and more careful, and each crack louder than the last. Uncle Jerry, Raymond's older brother, the one who'd organized the catering and rented the church microphone, walked over with the slow, reluctant stride of a man who didn't want to be involved but couldn't look away. He read the reconciliation page. He looked at his brother. He said, "Ray, this is pretty clear." He said it quietly, but in a yard where 43 people had stopped talking, quietly carried further than a shout. If you've ever stood in a yard where 43 people went silent, and the silence itself became the audit finding nobody would say out loud, share this with someone who needs to hear it. You'll want to hear what happened next. I closed the binder. I didn't leave it open for display. I closed it the way I close every completed engagement file. Both hands, spine facing me, tabs aligned, cover flush. I said, "Dad, I didn't come here to ruin your party. I came because you stood in front of everyone and called what I did a contribution. It wasn't a contribution. It was a collection, and the books don't balance." I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Denise had been right. When the work product is sound, the findings don't need a closing argument. They just need air. The barbecue didn't end immediately. People are strange that way. They kept eating, kept talking in voices so low the conversations sounded like murmuring water, kept glancing at the binder on the table like it was a centerpiece nobody had ordered and nobody knew how to remove. My father sat in a lawn chair near the garage with his hands on his knees and didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the evening. Tyler sat with our mother for over an hour, reading through the document section by section, asking questions she answered with the careful honesty of someone who was learning the answers at the same time she was speaking them. I drove back to my hotel, a Hampton Inn off the interstate, room 214, nothing dramatic, and sat on the edge of the bed with the overhead light off and the air conditioner cycling through its rhythm. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt like someone who had just closed a long overdue engagement and discovered that the client was family, and the finding was personal, and the reconciliation was going to take longer than any billable hour could measure. The consequences unfolded over the following weeks, the way findings tend to cascade when you pull one thread in a system that was held together by silence. My mother retained a financial counselor, someone from Denise's referral network, a woman named Patricia who specialized in late-life financial literacy for women who'd been excluded from household finances. The boat, still sitting at that marina slip, became a pressure point in conversations I wasn't part of. The hunting lease was not renewed. My father's retirement, which should have been a season of rest and gratitude, became instead the season his credibility was reassessed by every person who'd stood in that yard and heard the numbers. Tyler called me 2 weeks after the party. His voice was quieter than usual, not softer, just more deliberate, like he was choosing each word the way he chose each step on unfamiliar terrain. He said, "I should have been paying more attention." I told him he'd been stationed overseas for most of it, that he couldn't have known. He said, "That's not an excuse, Marin. That's a fact. And facts aren't always the same thing as excuses." It was the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me. I wrote it in the margin of a legal pad, because some sentences are worth keeping outside your head. If this story reached something in you, if there was a moment when you realized the help you were giving your family wasn't help at all, it was a payment plan for someone else's comfort, tell me. I read every single one. My father called once, 3 weeks after the barbecue. He didn't apologize. He said, "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone." I said, "You didn't have to take $143,000 from your 15-year-old daughter and spend it on a base boat. But here we are." Silence. Then, "I was going to give it back," I said. "Dad, I've heard that sentence from every client who got caught with unreconciled disbursements. The ones who meant it had a payment plan attached. Do you have a payment plan?" He didn't answer. I told him I'd help him build one. I told him I'd sit down with him and Mom and go through the real numbers, the real income, the real expenses, the real path forward. I told him I wasn't offering because I owed him. I was offering because reconciliation is literally what I do for a living, and I'm good at it. But I was not going to fund his retirement the way I funded his weekends on the lake. That part was over. That line item was closed. Sometimes I wonder if I should have pulled him aside before the speech, handed him the findings privately, given him the chance to correct the record in his own words, on his own terms. Maybe that would have been kinder. But kindness hadn't produced a single honest entry in those penciled columns in 12 years. Sometimes the only way to balance the books is to open them where everyone can see the entries. The composition notebook is gone now. My mother told me she found it in a drawer in the kitchen and threw it out. Not ceremonially, not with anger, just the way you throw out something that served its purpose and whose purpose turned out to be different than what you thought. But I still have the photograph I took of it years ago. The one with the M column, all those penciled numbers in my father's careful handwriting, each entry representing a paycheck I earned, and a story I was told about where it went. I keep the photo in my phone, not as evidence anymore, as a reminder that the most dangerous audits are the ones you avoid running on the people closest to you, and that every debit has a corresponding credit, even the ones nobody wants to read. That's my story. And the binder is still in my filing cabinet in Charlotte, properly tabbed and indexed, because some work products you keep even after the engagement is closed. And now, if you're watching this, I want to ask you something. If someone had been collecting from you for 12 years and then stood up at a party and called it your gift to the family, would you have corrected the record in front of everyone? Or would you have waited for a private moment that might never have come? If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell me one word: ledger. Because that's what I want every person watching this to understand. The people who take from you are counting on the fact that you'll never count it up. The moment you open the ledger, the story changes. This story is fictional, created for dramatic entertainment, education, and reflection. But the lesson underneath it is real. Somewhere right now, someone is handing over 30% of something they earned to someone who never showed them where it went. And the only thing standing between them and the truth is the audit they haven't run yet.